In April of 1866, in the rugged frontier town of Beaver, Utah, a boy named Robert Leroy Parker was born. He was the first of 13 children in a struggling Mormon family. His parents, immigrants from England, worked tirelessly on their small farm, hoping for a better future. But life on the frontier was harsh, and young Robert quickly learned that survival demanded strength, courage, and sometimes bending the rules.
As Robert grew older, he became restless. He found work on nearby ranches, mastering the skills of riding, roping, and shooting. These weren't just the tasks of a cowboy, they were the tools of survival in the untamed American West. Robert stood tall, carried himself with quiet confidence, and had a smile that could win anyone's trust. His charm and skill would one day set him apart, not as a ranch hand, but as an outlaw.
The turning point came when Robert met Mike Cassidy, a seasoned cowboy and cattle rustler. Mike was no bloodthirsty killer. He was a survivor who knew how to take what he needed from the wealthy ranchers. Robert admired his boldness, his independence, and his disregard for authority. Years later, Robert would take Cassidy's last name as his own, and when a short job in a butcher's shop earned him the nickname Butch, the legend of Butch Cassidy was born.
Butch's first run-in with the law was almost innocent. As a teenager, he broke into a closed store, leaving behind a note promising to pay for the clothes he had taken. It was a prank, but also a sign of what was to come. By his 20s, he was stealing horses and cattle, serious crimes in the West, where justice was swift and brutal. Butch, however, was clever. He avoided violence whenever possible, relying instead on wit, planning, and his growing network of allies. In 1889, Butch Cassidy made his move into outlaw history. Along with accomplices, he robbed the San Miguel Valley Bank in Telluride, Colorado, escaping with more than $20,000. For a young outlaw, it was a fortune. The robbery was daring, carefully planned, and successful. Word spread quickly across the frontier. Cassidy was no longer just Robert Parker, the ranch hand. He was Butch Cassidy, the outlaw leader who could outsmart the law.
To many, Butch Cassidy became a folk hero, a man who robbed banks and railroads instead of poor farmers. Unlike other outlaws, he had a reputation for avoiding unnecessary violence. The law called him a thief. Ordinary people called him clever. And soon, other men who shared his vision of freedom and fortune would gather around him. Together, they would become one of the most notorious gangs in the history of the Wild West, the Wild Bunch.
By the mid-1890s, Butch Cassidy was no longer working alone. Outlaws from across the West, drifters, sharpshooters, and horse thieves were drawn to him. He was calm, intelligent, and above all, he was fair. Unlike many gang leaders, Cassidy treated his men as equals. The group came to be known as the Wild Bunch, and soon their name would strike fear into banks, railroads, and lawmen alike.
The Wild Bunch had a reputation for being daring but disciplined. Their robberies were not reckless shootouts in the streets. They were carefully planned operations. Butch Cassidy preferred to avoid killing whenever possible. The goal was simple: take the money, escape fast, and live to fight another day. They targeted banks and trains, the beating heart of a rapidly modernizing America.
One of their most famous exploits came in 1899, when the Wild Bunch robbed a Union Pacific train near Wilcox, Wyoming. The gang blew open a safe with dynamite, scattering dollar bills and gold coins across the desert. Witnesses recalled the chaos as money literally flew through the air. It was the kind of story that turned Butch Cassidy from a criminal into a living legend. Newspapers across the country reported it, and the public couldn't get enough.
But the robberies drew attention from powerful enemies.
The Pinkerton National Detective Agency, the most feared private law enforcement in America, put their best men on the case. They tracked the wild bunch across states, through deserts, mountains, and small towns. Posters with Butch Cassidy's face appeared everywhere. Yet time and time again, Cassidy and his men managed to slip away.
The gang's greatest secret was their hideout, hole in the wall, a remote pass in the rugged mountains of Wyoming. Here, they built cabins, stashed supplies, and rested between robberies. It was a natural fortress, nearly impossible for lawmen to attack. At Hole in the Wall, the Wild Bunch lived like kings, protected by the very wilderness of the American West. To ordinary people, the Wild Bunch became both admired and feared. Some saw them as folk heroes who struck against powerful banks and railroads. Others called them dangerous criminals. But what no one could deny was that they had style. They wore fine suits when photographed, posed confidently with their pistols, and laughed at the law. They were outlaws, but they were also celebrities. In the late 1890s, Butch Cassidy met a man who would become his closest partner, Harry Longabaugh, better known as the Sundance Kid. Skilled with a gun, quiet by nature, and fiercely loyal, Sundance was the perfect counterpart to Cassidy's charm and leadership. Together, they became an unstoppable duo, the brains and the gun, the strategist and the sharpshooter. History would remember them not as Robert Parker and Harry Longabaugh, but as Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. With Sundance at his side, Cassidy's gang reached the peak of its power. The Wild Bunch carried out daring train robberies across Wyoming, Montana, and New Mexico. Their take from each job was enormous, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars. Butch's leadership kept the gang organized. He made rules: no unnecessary killing, no reckless violence. They stole, yes, but they also lived by a strange code of honor. This code gave them a reputation unlike any other outlaw gang of the West. As the robberies piled up, so did the heat. The Pinkertons, America's most relentless detective agency, tightened their grip. Detectives followed rumors, tracked fresh horse trails, and spoke to townsfolk. Cassidy and Sundance found themselves constantly on the move, one step ahead of the law. They crossed deserts, mountains, and plains, disappearing into the wilderness whenever the law drew near. In 1900, the gang did something unthinkable. They posed for a professional photograph. Dressed in suits, bowler hats, and polished boots, they looked more like bankers than bandits. The photo soon reached the Pinkertons, and it became one of the most famous images of outlaws in American history. For the gang, it was a bold statement. They weren't just criminals hiding in the shadows. They were men who dared to laugh at the law. But as their fame grew, so did the danger. Local sheriffs, state posses, and Pinkertons hunted them relentlessly. The West was changing. Railroads stretched across the land, towns became cities, and the frontier was shrinking. There was less room for men like Cassidy and Sundance. The Wild Bunch slowly began to break apart. Some members were captured, others killed. By 1901, Cassidy knew that their time in America was running out. Cassidy made a bold decision. Along with Sundance and Sundance's partner, Etta Place, he would leave the United States behind. The plan was simple: escape to South America, start fresh, and leave the law behind forever. Butch Cassidy believed that the frontier spirit wasn't dead, it just lived elsewhere. And so, in 1901, the two most famous outlaws of the Wild West boarded a ship bound for Argentina. In 1901, Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, and Sundance's partner, Etta Place, left the United States behind. They boarded a ship and sailed for Argentina, hoping to start fresh, far from the lawmen and detectives who pursued them across the American frontier. In Patagonia, southern Argentina, they purchased land and began life as cattle ranchers. For a time, it seemed that the dream was real. The two most wanted men in America became respectable ranchers, riding across the plains not as outlaws, but as landowners.
But the past has a way of catching up. In 1905, rumors spread of two North American ranchers living too well, too fast. Soon after, a bank robbery in Argentina was carried out by men who matched the description of Cassidy and Sundance. Although evidence was thin, suspicion grew. The Pinkertons extended their reach even into South America, passing information to local authorities. Life as peaceful ranchers was no longer safe. Once again, Cassidy and Sundance were forced back into the shadows of outlaw life. By 1906, Cassidy and Sundance moved further north into Bolivia. Bolivia was rough, poor, and remote, perfect for men who wanted to disappear. They took jobs in the mining towns, sometimes guarding payroll shipments, other times planning their next move. But the law was never far behind. In November of 1908, near the small mining town of San Vicente, Cassidy and Sundance attempted one last robbery, stealing the payroll of a local mine. But this time, their luck ran out.
Bolivian soldiers quickly surrounded the house where the outlaws had taken shelter. A fierce gunfight broke out in the darkness. Villagers later reported hearing explosions and rifle shots that lasted through the night. In the morning, the soldiers entered. Inside, they found two bodies, believed to be the American bandits Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. But the truth of what happened that night remains a mystery. Some say Sundance was badly wounded, and Cassidy ended his friend's life before turning the gun on himself. Others claim the soldiers killed them both in the chaos. What is certain is that the Wild Bunch ended not with glory, but in a dusty Bolivian room.
Yet, even in death, the legend grew. Rumors spread that Cassidy survived, faking his death and returning quietly to America under a false name. Some claimed to have seen him in Wyoming years later, living a quiet life as a rancher. The mystery of his fate only added to his myth. Was he killed in Bolivia, or did he escape once more? Historians debate the truth to this day, but one thing is certain. The legend of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid will never die. When the dust settled in Bolivia, the world believed that Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid were gone. Newspapers across America carried the story. The two most famous outlaws of the West had met their end. But death did not end their story. It transformed them. In the decades that followed, their names became larger than life. The Wild West was fading into history, but Cassidy and Sundance lived on, in songs, in stories, and in whispers around campfires.
Even as reports of their deaths spread, rumors began to surface. Some claimed Cassidy survived, returning secretly to Utah under another name. Others insisted Sundance was seen years later in Chile. Letters, secondhand stories, and unverified sightings kept the legend alive. Perhaps the truth was too simple for a world hungry for myth. Perhaps people wanted to believe that these outlaws, who had cheated death so many times, had done so once more.
By the mid-20th century, the story of Cassidy and Sundance had entered popular culture. In 1969, Hollywood released Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, starring Paul Newman and Robert Redford. The film was a box office triumph, portraying the outlaws as charming, witty, and almost heroic. Audiences around the world fell in love with the duo. In the movie, they went out in a blaze of glory, two men against an entire army, charging bravely into legend. It wasn't the dark, uncertain end of Bolivia. It was Hollywood's version of immortality.
Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid became symbols of something greater than themselves. They represented freedom, rebellion, and the refusal to be tamed by the rules of society.
To some, they were criminals. To others, they were folk heroes, standing against the growing power of banks and corporations. Their code of avoiding unnecessary violence separated them from the bloodthirsty killers of the era. They were outlaws, yes, but outlaws with a conscience.
Today, more than a century after their final ride, the names Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid remain etched into history. Their story is told in books, movies, and museums. Tourists still visit the ruins of San Vicente in Bolivia, searching for traces of the outlaws. Others stand before Cassidy's childhood home in Utah, imagining the restless boy who would become the West's most famous outlaw. Perhaps the truth of their final fate will never be known, but perhaps that is the way legends are meant to live, not as facts, but as timeless stories.
They were men of their time, restless, daring, flawed, and unforgettable. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid did not just live in the Wild West, they defined it. And though their lives ended long ago, their legend still rides on, across deserts, mountains, and into the imagination of all who hear their names.